stay until 7 o'clock at night. She knew I had to clean the joint for action around 9. One day, around noon, I asked her, "Do you love me enough to do anything for me?" She said, "Yes." So I said, "Even turn the trick?" She said, "Anything." I put my clothes on and went to the street and saw an old gambler whom I knew was a trick and told him what was upstairs. Sure enough, he gave me a $5 bill, the asking price, and I took him upstairs and let him in on her. She turned him in less than 5 minutes. My 17-year-old brain reeled. This was still the Depression. I could get rich with this girl and drive a big white Packard. My next prospect was all wrong. He was an acquaintance of the band leader, June's father. He went upstairs, saw her, and called the father in Pittsburgh. The father called the local police department, and my pimping career died a borning. When the detective came, I was still out there looking for tricks for the down payment on that big white Packard. Diamond Tooth's bullshit had screwed me for certain. My mother, of course, was shocked. She was sure it was a frame-up. That June, that evil girl, had led her sweet little Bobby astray. At the county jail 2 days before my trial, I left my cell on an attorney consultation pass. A short, gopher-faced Negro sat in the cage at an old oak desk, grinning at me. My blood ran cold. My palms got slippery wet as I took a seat across from him. The gleaming yellow gold teeth filling his mouth had been a flash of doom. Christ, I thought, a deep South nigger lip. Didn't Mama know that most of them turn to jelly when defending a criminal case? The rodent wiped his blue-black brow with a soggy handkerchief and said, "Well, Bobby, it seems that you're in a little trouble, huh? I am Attorney Williams, an old friend of your family. I knew your mother as a girl." My eyes sent special delivery murder across the table to that ugly bastard. I said, "It isn't a little trouble. Under the max, I can get a fin." He fingered his dollar necktie and hoisted his starved shoulders inside the jacket of his cheap vine and said, "Oh, now let's not be fatalistic. You are a first offender, and I am positive it will mitigate the charge. Rest assured, I will press the court for leniency. Now tell me the whole truth about your trouble." Anger, everything drained out of me. I was lost, stricken. The phony would lead me to the slaughter. I knew I was already tried and convicted and sentenced to the joint. The only loose end was for how long. Without hearing it myself, I ran down the details to him and stumbled blindly back to my cell. On my trial day in the courtroom, the shaky bastard was so nervous before the bench when he pleaded me guilty that the same cheap vine that he had worn at our first meeting was soaked by his sweat. He was so shook up by the stern face and voice of the white, hawk-faced judge that he forgot to ask for leniency. That awful fear the white folks put into him down south was still painfully alive in him. He just stood there, paralyzed, waiting for the judge to sentence me. So I looked up into the frosty blue eyes and said, "Your Honor, I am sorry for what I did. I have never been in trouble before. If Your Honor will just give me a break this time, I swear before the Lord I won't ever come back down here. Please, Your Honor, don't send me to the pen." The frost deepened in his eyes as he looked down at me and intoned, "You are a vicious young man. Your crime against that innocent young girl, against the laws of this state, is inexcusable. The very nature of your crime precludes the possibility of probation. For your own good and for that of society's, I sentence you to the state reformatory to a term for not less than 1 year and for not more than 18 months. I hope it teaches you a lesson. I shrugged off the wet hand of the lip from my shoulder, avoided the tear-reddened eyes of Mama sobbing quietly in the rear of the courtroom, and stuck my hands out to the bailiff for the icy-cold handcuffs. June's old man was a big wheel with lots of muscle in the courts. He had gone behind the scenes and pulled strings and put the cinch on the joint for me. My sentence was for carnal knowledge and abuse, reduced from pandering, because you can't pander for anything except a whore, and June's old man wasn't about to go for that. Yes, I was sure working at that first patch of gray in my mother's hair. Steve would have been proud of me, don't you think? My sentence to the Wisconsin Green Bay Reformatory almost cracked Mama up. There were several repeaters from the reformatory on my tier at county jail who tried to bug the first offenders with terrible stories about the hard time up at the reformatory, while we were waiting for the van to take us upstate to the reformatory. I was too dumb to feel anything. A fool I was to think the dummy was a fairy tale. And the 2 weeks that I waited, Mama wrote me a letter every day and visited twice. Mama's guilt and heartbreak were weighing heavily on her. Back in Rockford, she had been a dutiful churchgoer, leading a Christian life until Steve came on the scene. But now, when I read her long, rambling letters crammed with threats of fire and brimstone for me if I didn't get Jesus in my heart and respect the Holy Ghost and the fire, I realized that poor Mama was becoming a religious fanatic to save her sanity. The pressures of Henry's death, and now my plight, must have been awful. The van came to get us on a stormy, thunderous morning. As we stepped into the van, handcuffed together, I saw Mama standing in the icy, driving rain, waving goodbye. I could feel a hot, throbbing lump at the base of my throat to see her standing there, looking so sad and lonesome, cowering beneath the battering rain. I could feel the tears aching to flow, but I couldn't cry. Mama never told me how she found out the time the van would come. I still wonder how she found out, and what her thoughts were out there in the storm as she watched me start my journey. The state called it reformatory, but believe me, it was a prison for real. My belly fluttered when the van pulled into the prison road leading to the joint. The van had been vibrating with horseplay and profane ribbing among the 20-odd prisoners. Only one of them had sat tensely and silently during the entire trip, the fat fellow next to me. But when those high slate-gray walls loomed grimly before us, it was as if a giant fist had slugged the breath from us all. Even the repeaters who had served time behind those walls were silent, tight-faced. I started to believe those stories they had told back in county jail. The van went through 3 gates manned by rock-faced bucks, carrying scoped, high-powered rifles. 3 casket-gray cell houses stood like mute mourners beneath the bleak, sunless sky. For the first time in my life, I felt raw, grinding fear. The fat Negro sitting next to me was a former schoolmate of mine in high school. He had been a dedicated member of the Holiness Church then. I had never gotten friendly with him because his only interest at the time seemed to be his church and Bible. He didn't smoke, swear, chase broads, or gamble. He had been a rock-ribbed square. His name was Oscar. Apparently he was still square because now his eyes were closed, and I could hear bits of prayer as he whispered softly. Oscar's prayer was abruptly cut off by the screech of the van's brakes as it stopped in front of the prison's check-in station and bathhouse. We clambered out and stood in line to have our handcuffs removed. 2 screws started at each end of the line unlocking the cuffs. As they moved toward the middle of the line, they stifled the thin whispers of the men. They said to each man, "Button it up. Silence. No talking." Oscar was shaking and trembling in front of me as we filed into a brightly lit, high-ceilinged room. A rough pine counter stretched for 20 yards down a green and gray flagstone floor that looked clean enough to eat from. This was part of the shiny, clean skin of the apple. The inside was rotting and foul. Cons with starch white faces stood behind the long counter, guessing our sizes as we passed them and passing out faded pieces of our uniform, from caps to brogans. We passed with our bundles into a large room. A tall, silent screw, dazzling with brass buttons and gold braid on his navy blue uniform, slashed his lead-loaded cane through the air like a vocal sword, directing us to put our bundles on a long bench and to undress for short-arm inspection, and a brief exam by the prison croaker seated at a battered steel desk in the back of the room. Finally, we all had been checked by the croaker and showered. The gold-spangled screw raised his talkative cane. It told us to go out the door and turn left, then straight ahead. 2 screws marched alongside as we made it toward a squat sandstone building 200 yards away. Was that talking cane the dummies? I heard it before I saw it. A loud scraping, thunder-laced with a hollow roar. Never before had I heard anything like it. Then, mysteriously, in the dimness, countless young grim faces seemed to be bobbing in a sea of gray. 100 feet ahead, I saw the mystery. Hundreds of gray-clad cons were lock-stepping from the mess halls into the 3-cell houses. They were an eerie sight in the twilight, marching mutely in cadence, like tragic robot soldiers. The roaring thunder was the scrape and thump of their heavy prison brogans. We reached the squat building. We were to stay in its quarantine cells for the next 10 days. All fish, new cons, were housed here to be given a thorough medical checkout and classification before being assigned to work details out in population. I got a putrid taste of the inside of that apple when cons in white uniforms and peaked caps gave us our supper through a slot in our cell doors. It was barley soup with a hunk of brown bread. It would have made great shrapnel in a grenade. I was new and learning, so instead of just gulping it down, I took a long, close look at the odd little things black-dotted at one end. I puked until my belly cramped. The barley in the soup was lousy with worms. The lights went out at 9. Every hour or so, a screw came by the row of cells. He would poke the bright eye of his flashlight into a cell and then squint his eyes as he looked into each cell. I wondered if it were a capital crime in this joint to get caught having an affair with Lady Five Fingers. I flapped my ears when I heard one of the white repeaters running down the joint in a whisper to a fish. Oscar was listening too, because he had stopped praying in his cell next to mine. The white fish was saying, "Look, Rocky, what the hell gives with that hack in the bathhouse? Why don't the jack-off never rap? What's with that cane bit?" The repeater said, "The son of a bitch is stir-crazy. His voice box screwed up on him a dime ago. He's been the brass nuts here for a double dime, and guess how the bastard lost his rapper?" The screw in his light was making the rounds again, so the repeater got on the dummy. When the screw had passed, he continued. The creep was called Foghorn by the cons before his trouble made him a dummy. They say the bastard's bellows could be heard from one side of the joint to the other. He's the meanest captain of screws this joint ever had. In the last double dime, he has croaked 2 white cons and 4 spades with his cane. He hates niggers. Oscar was praying like mad now. He had heard what the repeater said about those 4 Negroes. The fish wanted a loose end tied for him. He said, "Yeah, Rocky, just to glim him and you know he's rough. But what in the hell cut his box off?" The repeater said, "Oh, the vine has it. He treated his wife and Crumb Crusher worse than he did the cons.